In this video, we will talk about activity variances and revenue and spending variances, two categories of variances that will help us unpack a little bit the static budget variance. So let's first talk about the activity variances. The activity variances are isolating the impact of selling more or less tops than expected. In this case here, we sold fewer tops than expected. So to calculate these variances, I'm going to illustrate it by inserting two new columns between the budgeted income statement and the flexible budget. And then I'll create a title here, Activity Variances, and I'll go ahead and merge and center that. And what I'm going to do now is just calculate the absolute difference between the budgeted income statement number and the flexible budget number. All right, so I'm going to do that for every line item here. And let's go ahead and format this a little bit. I'll remove that 0, and then to put the underlines back in there, I can just highlight these cells, click this paintbrush here, the formatting paintbrush, and then highlight the cells that I want to format like them. And now it's formatted the same. All right, so now we need to label these as whether they are favorable or unfavorable. So let's think about this. All else equal, if we sold fewer tops than expected, that would mean our revenue is less than expected, which it is, and so that would have an unfavorable impact on profit. So that's U for unfavorable. What about direct material? It's the opposite here, right? If you sell fewer tops than expected, all else equal, then that means you're spending less on materials. So that would be a favorable variance. Direct labor would also be favorable, and variable manufacturing overhead would also be favorable. All right, so you can see that the costs are favorable when you sell less than expected, but the revenue is unfavorable. What about contribution margin? Well, this is a net number here. And so this will also be unfavorable because all else equal, if we sell less tops than expected, our contribution margin will be less than expected as well. Now, the fixed costs will always be the same between the budgeted income statement and the flexible budget. So that's neither favorable or unfavorable. And then last of all, the difference between operating profit is unfavorable because, again, if the only thing that changes is you sell less than expected, your profit will be less than expected. All right, so those are the activity variances. Now, the key variance here is really just this operating profit number. That's the one that kind of summarizes the overall effect of selling fewer tops than expected. So now that we've calculated those variances, let's do a little bit of formatting that will be helpful to us as we analyze these variances later on. Specifically, let's label unfavorable variances as negative numbers and favorable variances as positive numbers. The way we can do that is we can change the order in which we're subtracting numbers from one another. So for revenue here, since this is unfavorable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the flexible budget revenue and subtract from it the budgeted income statement revenue. Okay, so that's a negative number. Then for direct material, direct labor, variable overhead, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to take the budgeted number and subtract from it the flexible number. And then contribution margin will be like revenue, so we'll take the flexible number, subtract from it the budgeted number. And then for operating profit, we'll do the flexible profit minus the budgeted profit. So this is really helpful because now if we look at, for instance, the revenue and variable cost variances, if we highlight all of those and go down here in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see that the sum is a negative 577.5, which is the same as our contribution margin. Okay, so even though we don't talk about variances as positive or negative numbers, when we want to aggregate them, the favorable and unfavorable do counteract each other. And so it's helpful for mathematical purposes to label them consistently in such a way that I think it makes more sense that unfavorable are negative and favorable are positive. Okay, so these are the activity variances. They are isolating the impact on profit of selling fewer tops than expected. Let's just go ahead and reformat these a little bit by decreasing the amount of space they take up. And now what we're going to do is talk about the revenue and spending variances. And these are going to be the difference between line items on the flexible budget and the actual income statement. So to calculate these, I will insert two new columns between the flexible budget and actual income statement. I'll give it a label. And now I'll go ahead and just calculate the absolute value of the difference between each of these items here. And let's clean this up a little bit. Perfect. Now let's identify whether each of these line item variances are favorable or unfavorable. So let's start with this revenue variance right here. We're holding the amount of tops constant between the flexible budget and the actual income statement. So because the revenue on the actual income statement is less than on the flexible budget, that means something happened in actuality that reduced our profit relative to what we would have expected it to be. So in other words, this has a negative impact on profit, and so that is unfavorable, okay? Or the revenue is less than the flexible budget, so that's unfavorable. It has a negative impact on profit. All right, how about direct material? We spent less on direct material than expected, given that level of sales volume, so this is a favorable variance. For direct labor, we spent more than expected, so this is unfavorable. For variable overhead, we spent more than expected, so that's unfavorable. Our contribution margin is less than expected, so that's unfavorable. And this is really just the sum or the net of these variances up here. All right, and then the fixed costs, we actually spent less than expected, so that is favorable. And then overall, our actual profit is less than expected, so this is unfavorable right here. Okay, so these are the revenue and spending variances. Let's go ahead and reformat these such that unfavorable variances are negative and favorable variances are positive. And we can do that using the same pattern that we did before. Specifically, for the revenue, we'll take the actual revenue, subtract from it the flexible revenue. That's a negative number. But for these costs, we will take the flexible budget number and subtract the actual number. And then contribution margin, it's like revenue, so we're going to take the actual number, subtract from it the flexible number. And then profit, we'll take, again, the actual number, subtract from it the flexible number. All right, and let's just verify that these add up. So if we highlight all of these cells here, these variable numbers right here, they are negative 5753.55, which is the same as our contribution margin. And then if we add on to that the fixed cost variance, now the sum of those numbers is 5503.55, which is negative, which is the unfavorable operating profit variance right there. Let's highlight a relationship now among these variances. Let's focus on the operating profit variances here. If we add up the activity variance, the net of all the activity variances, it is $577.50 unfavorable. If we add that to the net of the revenue and spending variances, it's $5,503.55 unfavorable. That adds up to $6,081.05 unfavorable. That should sound familiar because that is our static budget variance. Okay, so again, what we did is we broke that down into two categories. The activity variances quantify what would have happened if everything went according to plan, except that we sold fewer tops than expected. And then the revenue and spending variances say, okay, after controlling for the number of tops, we've got the same number of tops in our flexible budget and our actual income statement. We can see that various things happened to result in our profit being less than expected. So most of our static budget variance is due to things that happened on the revenue and spending side. All right, now are these variances actionable? Well, I would suggest that they are a lot more actionable than the static budget variance. For instance, we can go to the sales department and find out why we sold less than expected, and it looks like we must have sold the tops for a lower price than expected as well. So we sold fewer and at a lower price. Does it mean it's their fault? Not necessarily. It could be various market conditions that made it so it was just unlikely to sell the same number of tops at the expected sales price. But at least we can start knowing who we can go to get more insight. Similarly, we could look at the materials cost, and whoever in the manufacturing department is responsible for using material, or maybe the procurement department for purchasing the material, we can go find out more about why they spent less on material than expected, and then why they spent more on labor and variable overhead than expected. and why the fixed costs were less than expected. Okay, so it's giving us some numbers, and if we're focusing on maybe the thing that is hurting us the most, we might want to start with direct labor and go talk to our production manager. Find out maybe is there a different mix of skilled versus unskilled laborers? Did we pay them a different amount? What's going on here? Right? So it's helping us to gain additional insight. I want to highlight a couple of them that have special names. Okay, so specifically this 577.5 unfavorable is called the sales volume variance. Now, we typically don't care a lot about the activity variances for each of the line items. We really just want to see the overall impact. So that's why we're just looking at that number right there. And then the difference between our flexible revenue and our actual revenue, that's called the sales price variance, meaning the only thing that should be varying here is the sales price. Overall, we sold our tops for an average price that was less than expected. Okay, so we can call this the sales price variance. Now, I'm not going to copy and paste any of these other spending variances over here because we're actually going to break these down into smaller components. And we'll talk about those in later videos.